The wine glass was still trembling in my hand when my Aunt Elaine laughed and said my mother must have been delusional to leave me that junk. Still, I kept my eyes down, letting her words rot in the silence between us. As my cousin Trent leaned in, calling the pendant charity jewelry for the family disappointment, the crystal rang like a warning bell. While their laughter bounced off the walls, the weight of the sapphire pressed into my palm, heavy as truth. The same initials carved into its clasp matched a woman erased from our bloodline long before any of us were born. That's when I realized they weren't mocking jewelry, they were mocking my mother, and I don't bury blood, I defend it. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. They let the silence hang too long after the will was read, like they were waiting for someone to protest. No one did, just a few dry coughs and the shuffle of papers. The lawyer closed her folder and said that was it. No surprises, no amendments. I was the only one still sitting when the rest started drifting toward the wine. Elaine made her way over with a practiced frown, the kind that looked like sympathy from a distance but never made it to her eyes. She placed a small wooden box on the table beside me, not wrapped, not labeled, just left there like a leftover no one wanted to claim. "This was in your mother's closet," she said, brushing imaginary dust from the lid. "She probably meant to throw it out, looks like something you'd find at a swap meet." I didn't touch it, not yet. I just looked at the faded brass hinges and the faint pattern carved into the wood. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even clean, but my mother had kept it in the top drawer of her dresser under old scarves and her wedding gloves. Trent walked by with a half-full glass of Cabernet, glanced down and snorted. "You sure that's not a kid's craft project? What is that charity case sparkle?" They laughed, not cruelly, just easily, like people who'd already decided what mattered: the house, the stocks, the insurance. A jewelry box didn't register. I slipped it into my bag and excused myself before dessert. No one offered a goodbye. Back home, I didn't open it right away. I left it on the kitchen counter while I changed, fed the cat, checked my phone. The room felt too quiet, the kind of quiet you don't notice until it starts pressing in. Eventually, I sat at the table and flipped the latch with my thumb. Inside, velvet, faded to gray at the corners but still soft. 5 pieces. One of them, a pendant, caught the light even with the kitchen overheads dimmed. Deep blue, almost black until you really looked at it. The setting was old, intricate, not flashy, the kind of detail you don't find on anything mass-produced. I held it up, the chain sliding over my wrist like it remembered someone else. The stone was cold, heavier than it looked. The ring beside it was thick, plain, except for a ridge running through the center, heavier than it should have been. The clasp on another piece, a tarnished bracelet, had initials etched into it. Not my mother S, not mine, MAH or maybe WAH. The last letter was worn nearly flat. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the box. These weren't trinkets. They weren't modern, and none of them looked like anything my mother had worn in the last decade or ever really. She never talked much about her family's past, said it was a mess of names and land and arguments best left buried. I always assumed she'd given up anything of real value long ago, after the divorce or before. But the look on her face the last time I saw her, the way she said, "Some things don't belong in glass cases," made more sense now. I wrapped the pendant in a napkin and placed it gently back in the box, followed by the rest. Then I tucked the whole thing into the back of my desk drawer and turned the key. I didn't know what it was worth, maybe nothing. But for the first time since she died, I had the feeling my mother had left me something on purpose, not to show off, not to sell. To keep. And maybe to figure out. The next morning, I found myself standing outside a small brick storefront I'd walked past a dozen times but never noticed. The awning was faded. The letters on the window read Vera Jacobs, Independent Appraisals. No business hours, no open sign. Just a tarnished doorbell and a list of credentials taped to the glass like a quiet dare. Inside, the air was cool and dry, like a museum without the ego. A single lamp burned over a suede-lined tray at the center of a long mahogany desk. The room was silent except for the tick of an antique clock and the rustle of paper as a woman, gray hair pulled into a low twist, no makeup, wire-rimmed glasses, finished whatever she was writing before acknowledging me. You're early, she said, eyes still on the page. I can wait. You brought pieces. I nodded and reached into my satchel, pulling out the wrapped box and setting it down gently. She still hadn't looked at me. Zid. I obeyed. Vera Jacobs didn't strike me as someone you argued with. She moved with the kind of calm that doesn't have time for performance, deliberate, exact. One by one, she lifted each item from the velvet, placing them onto the tray like puzzle pieces that belonged somewhere she hadn't quite defined yet. The ring, she weighed. The bracelet, she noted with a small hum. When she reached the pendant, something shifted. Her fingertips hesitated just slightly as she turned it in the light. Then again, then back. She didn't say a word, but I saw her jaw tighten. She adjusted her glasses and reached behind her for a loop, then a gem tester. She didn't explain, didn't narrate, just worked, focused and fast. The pendant went under the light twice, then she stepped away and without asking walked to the door and turned the lock. I sat up straighter. Is something wrong? She looked at me fully for the first time. Do you know where this came from? My mother, I said, I think. Silence again, but not the kind that comes from uncertainty. This one was weighing its words. It's not glass or paste or synthetic, she said finally, returning to her desk. It's a cashmere sapphire, old, untouched, no heat treatment, exceptional depth. The room felt smaller. My mouth was dry, but I nodded like I understood. Can you put that in writing? She looked at me, head tilted slightly. Most people want that kind of information public. Why not just take it to auction? I don't want anyone to know I have it, not yet. She seemed to respect that, or at least she didn't question it. Understood. You'll need an alias for the file. I gave her one, my middle name and a version of my mother's maiden. She wrote it down without comment, then turned back to the pendant and began photographing it under calibrated lighting, each click sharp and clean, no wasted motion, no second takes. When I stood to leave, she handed me a slip of paper. Give me 4 days. I nodded, thank you. She didn't smile, just returned to the tray, already absorbed again. Outside, the street was quiet. I exhaled into the cold morning and tightened my coat, the weight of what she'd said settling across my shoulders like something I hadn't earned. Cashmere sapphire. And Vera hadn't asked what it was worth. That told me everything I needed to know. But it was the locked door that stayed with me. Lena didn't blink when I told her about the challenge. She sat at her desk, pen tapping gently against the edge of a yellow legal pad, glasses perched halfway down her nose like always. Of course they filed, she said. 2 weeks of silence is practically restraint for your aunt. I slid the copy of the petition across the table. They're claiming the will was an emotional manipulation, that my mother wasn't of sound mind when she named me sole beneficiary. Lena scanned the document with a sigh. This language is boilerplate. They don't have a shred of evidence. They don't need it though, they just need to make noise. She looked up at me, then we make sure none of it sticks. I nodded. We didn't talk about the box. I hadn't mentioned the pendant or Vera or anything that wasn't specifically listed in the will. I wasn't ready to speak it aloud yet, not even to Lena. Some things needed to stay in the dark until I understood the light they might throw. Later that week, she began filing protective motions, ones that limited discovery access, ones that challenged standing, ones that locked down personal property not named in the probate filing. She worked fast, surgical, and I let her. Meanwhile, I said nothing. Elaine left a voicemail laced with false sweetness. Claire, darling, maybe we can find a more equitable way to divide what's left. And Trent texted once with a sarcastic meme about inheritance wars, but I didn't answer. Let them think I was overwhelmed. Let them believe they'd gotten in my head. I moved the jewelry box to the back of my closet, buried beneath folded blankets and winter coats. I hadn't opened it since Vera's office. I didn't need to. That pendant was burned into my memory. The other pieces could wait. But I couldn't stop thinking about that lock click, the look on Vera's face before she asked the question. So I went back. This time she met me at the door without a word and handed me a manila folder before I could sit. Inside was a report, clean, professional, precise. It included measurements, photos, origin assessment. One line caught my eye: probable cashmere origin, no indication of synthetic enhancement. Underneath the folder, she slid over a thin, leather-bound register. "What's this?" I asked. "Early 20th century estate record," she said, flipping to a bookmarked page, "compiled by a historian in Charleston. I remembered a cross-reference from years ago. Low. Okay." There on brittle cream paper was a listing: blue pendant, 6.2 CT, gift from L to MAH 1911. My heart stuttered. "MAH," I murmured. "I saw those initials." She nodded. "Your piece isn't just rare, it was recorded, which means it can be traced." "Is that good or bad?" "That depends," she said, closing the book, "on how loudly your family intends to fight." I stared at the closed register, trying to imagine who L was, who MAH had been before her name became a footnote. I didn't know yet, but the line was there, a thread connecting me to something they hadn't expected. Back at home, I stood in the doorway of my closet, staring at the blankets that now hid everything they'd laughed at. My fingers itched to pull the box back out, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop, found the file Lena had created for estate notes, and added one line. "Possible historic claim, do not disclose contents unless absolutely necessary." Then I closed the document. And I waited. They chose the restaurant, an upscale place with exposed brick and soft jazz and prices that made a statement. I arrived 10 minutes early and asked for a table in the back. Less noise, fewer eyes. Elaine and Trent showed up late, of course, matching smugness, coordinated outerwear. She wore pearls that looked borrowed. He smelled like cologne you buy when you're trying to impress people who actually understand money. "Claire," Elaine said as she leaned in for a kiss on the cheek, "it's been too long." Trent gave me a grin with no warmth behind it. "Glad you came, thought you might still be hiding behind your lawyer." I smiled without showing teeth. "It's just dinner." Elaine ordered the bottle without asking. "Pinot, 2 glasses for them, 1 for me." I waited until the waiter stepped away before slipping my phone under the napkin on my lap and pressing record. They didn't notice. "We've been thinking," Elaine started, swirling her glass like she was auditioning for a role. "Maybe this doesn't need to be so legal, just a conversation between family. Your mother would have wanted that." Trent jumped in, always the sidekick. "Yeah, less courtroom, more kitchen table." I nodded like I was listening. Elaine reached for the bread basket, tore a piece without eating it. "Honestly, we're looking at listing the Holden house soon. The market's still decent and a fall sale could get ahead of interest rates, assuming this gets settled quickly." "Of course," I said, my voice even. "Spoke to a couple of antique dealers too," Trent added. "Just getting a feel for what's left. Some of those old pieces your mom held onto might be more valuable than she thought." Elaine laughed, a dry, performative sound. "Well, not that valuable. She had a talent for sentiment, not sense. Remember that oil painting in the foyer? She swore it was a real Hinton. Turned out to be some art student's senior project." Trent raised his glass, to wasted potential. I didn't join the toast. Elaine leaned in, tone quieter now. "Claire, sweetheart, I know you and your mother were close, but she didn't exactly make practical decisions. She put emotions into everything, especially the wrong things. It's why she left the estate in such a mess. I mean, she left you, what, a jewelry box?" My pulse didn't change. I sipped my wine. They didn't see the red light blinking beneath the napkin. They didn't notice the stillness in my shoulders or how I hadn't actually touched the bread. They just kept going, more confident with each sip, more cruel without realizing it. "She had no idea how to build value," Elaine continued. "She just clung to history like it could save her." "That's what we're doing now," Trent said, shaking his head, cleaning up her emotional clutter. I checked the time. "I should go," I said, standing slowly. "Early meeting." Elaine looked surprised. "Already? We haven't even ordered in trays." "You've given me a lot to think about." Trent smirked, glad we could be helpful. Outside, the air was sharp with early winter. I walked 2 blocks before pulling out my phone. 43 minutes of audio, clear, uninterrupted, names, implications, intent. By the time I got home, the file was already uploaded and sent. subject line, probate dinner for record only. I didn't even write a message. Lena would know what to do. I placed the phone on the counter, pulled off my coat, and poured the rest of the wine into the sink. I'd let them speak freely, that part was done. Now I'd let their words do the work. The envelope was heavier than I expected. Vera handed it to me without ceremony, her expression unreadable as always. No handshake, no recap, just the plain manila sleeve tucked between her fingers like a legal summons. I waited until I was back in the car, parked in the shade behind a quiet strip of antique stores, before I opened it. 3 pages, stamped, signed, certified. The words didn't blur. I read them twice, once out of disbelief, the second out of strategy. Cashmere origin, circa 1900–1910, 6.2 carats, no heat, no repair, retail valuation $617,000. I folded the appraisal and tucked it into the back of my leather-bound notebook. It didn't feel like a win, not yet, more like a loaded weapon I wasn't ready to fire. By that afternoon, Lena had the report scanned, encrypted, and filed under a newly formed trust, one with no traceable connection to my name outside her private record. The trust was anonymous, airtight, built to hold one item only. I'd used a name from a poem my mother once read aloud when I was little. I barely remembered the words, but the name stuck. It sounded like something no one would question, but everyone would miss. Lena looked at me over her glasses when I signed the papers. This means if they come for it, they won't find it. That's the idea. And if they ask about value? They won't, I said. They still think it's junk. But not for long. 2 days later, a courier arrived with a copy of a supplemental filing. Elaine had pushed for a revised probate review, requesting a court-ordered inventory of all unlisted and historically ambiguous assets. The language was dressed up to sound objective, but the subtext was clear: she was fishing. Lena didn't flinch. We'll respond in writing. You don't owe them transparency, not with this. Still, I didn't want the box in the house anymore. That night, I carried it to a private storage vault Lena had set up months earlier for another client, a space behind 2 layers of security, key-coded and fully insured. The manager, a quiet man in a navy wool vest, didn't ask what was inside. He just nodded when I placed the sealed container on the center shelf and signed the ledger. Walking away, I felt the weight lift from my hands, but not from my shoulders. At home, I found Trent's post waiting for me on Facebook, forwarded by a mutual acquaintance with the comment, "This about you." His caption read, "Imagine fighting over costume jewelry. LMAO, some people really think sentiment equals value." It had 6 likes, all from people I hadn't spoken to since high school. I didn't respond. I didn't even screenshot it for Lena. They were still mocking me with the same tired script, still blind. Good. Because now I had proof of something they'd never seen coming, something they couldn't steal, spin, or dilute with sarcasm. And if Elaine thought she was circling in on unlisted assets, she'd be circling for a long time. I pulled up the document Vera had given me and read it again, slower this time. The valuation was only a number. What mattered more were the other details: the origin, the preservation, the historical notation. All of it confirmed one thing. My mother hadn't just left me a pendant. She'd left me leverage. And I hadn't even used it yet. Vera called 2 days later, no preamble, no pleasantries. "There's an engraving, you missed it." I was already halfway to her shop before she hung up. This time, she didn't gesture for me to sit. She had the pendant laid out under a scope lit from 3 angles. The magnification showed a thin curve of metal, tarnished around the edges but intact. She didn't speak as she angled the loop toward me, just pointed. There, barely visible near the clasp, were 3 tiny letters etched into the gold, MAH beneath them, a date, 1911. I stepped back, heart tight in my chest. "Who was she?" Vera asked quietly. "I don't know," and I meant it. That night, I pulled my mother's file box from the top shelf of the hall closet, the one labeled family in her tidy handwriting. Faded photographs, handwritten invitations, a few birth records. I sifted through each piece, careful not to smudge the paper or lose track of names. Grandparents, second cousins, someone's baptism from 1952. But then, near the back, a brittle envelope with no stamp, just the name Margaret Ann Holden in faded fountain pen. Inside, a sepia photo of a woman in profile, hair swept back, standing beside a man in uniform. On the back, Maggie, Christmas before the fire, gone too soon. My hand stilled. I'd never heard her name. I called Lena the next morning. Can you find death records in Chatham County from around 1911? I asked. She didn't ask why, just said I'll have something by lunch. By 2 p.m., she'd emailed me a scan. Margaret A. Holden, deceased December 23, 1911. Fire at Fairview Estate. Remains unconfirmed. And below that, in a faded newspaper clipping, several valuables presumed lost, including jewelry from the family vault. I forwarded everything to Vera. She called 10 minutes later. It's the same MAH, she said. That engraving, it's the kind used by private jewelers before standardized hallmarking. The timeline fits. And if this pendant survived that fire, it's not just rare, it's unaccounted for history. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the phone pressed to my ear. Could it be considered an artifact? Yes, she said, potentially, especially if it's been missing for over a century and never formally transferred. And if it never passed through Elaine or my mother's hands, then legally it may not be theirs to claim at all. I stood there, watching the winter light move across the tile. The pendant had never belonged to my mother, not in the legal sense. It belonged to a woman the family had buried twice, once in fire, once in silence. And now it had surfaced through me. I didn't tell Lena what I was thinking, not yet. Instead, I sat at my desk that night and began drafting a provenance statement, just the facts, dates, chain of custody, record references. I left out anything emotional, anything that could be twisted or weaponized. When I was done, I saved it as a PDF and encrypted the file with a password only I knew. I didn't tell Elaine, I didn't tell Trent. Because this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about resurrection, about the kind of value you can't appraise, not in dollars, not in court. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Someone in the family had deliberately erased Margaret, not lost, erased. The fire may have started by accident. But the forgetting, that felt intentional. I reopened the envelope with her name on it and stared at the photograph again. Maggie turned slightly away from the camera, as if even then, she knew what they'd do. Lena didn't wait for the court date. She filed a preemptive motion within 48 hours of receiving Elaine's petition, and by the time I walked into her office that Friday morning, it was already stamped, certified, and logged into the system. A clean, confident dismantling of every accusation Elaine and Trent had lobbed in their latest round. The pendant is not in the probate inventory, Lena said calmly. It wasn't listed, wasn't declared, and there's no documented chain connecting it to your mother's estate. She handed me the copy like it was a final draft she already knew would hold. The report from Vera, I asked. Attached, as is the historical trace to MAH, the register listing, and your provenance statement. You were thorough. I almost smiled. She tapped the corner of the page. This is no longer just jewelry, it's a legacy asset, and it's off the table. What if they push again? Let them, her voice didn't rise. They're scrambling, that always makes people careless. I stayed in Lena's office while she took another call, watching the condensation bead along the edge of her tea mug. I was still staring at the slow slide of water down ceramic when the door buzzed. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Elaine Holden, no appointment, says it's urgent. Lena barely glanced up. Tell her I'm in a client meeting. She says she knows who, she's not leaving. Lena stood. No drama, I said quickly. Don't worry, she replied, smoothing her jacket. I've seen worse from better people. She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door nearly shut behind her, leaving it open just enough for me to hear what came next. Elaine's voice came sharp and fast. Where is she? My client doesn't take meetings based on threats, Lena said, voice cool. This isn't a threat. No, then what would you call crashing my office to demand access to something you have no legal claim to? I want the truth. That necklace wasn't just hers, it belonged to the family. Then maybe someone should have remembered the woman it actually belonged to. Silence. I couldn't see Elaine's face, but I could hear her breathing shift. heavier, quieter. Lena continued, Claire is not available and I won't tolerate another stunt like this. The court will be informed. Elaine said nothing. I heard heels pivot sharply, then the slam of the front door swinging closed behind her. Lena stepped back in, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. She's unraveling, she said. That's a good sign. She'll escalate, I said. She already has. She returned to her desk and sat down, all calm again. Your silence, she added, is your sharpest move right now. Keep using it. I nodded and rose to leave, my coat already over my arm. Before I stepped into the hallway, Lena handed me a sealed envelope. Just in case, she said. I didn't ask what was in it, I didn't need to. That night, as I was rinsing out a mug in the kitchen sink, my phone buzzed on the counter. Trent. A text, no greeting, just one line. We just want what's fair. That necklace belonged to all of us. I stared at the message for a long moment, then locked the screen without replying. Fair. They hadn't asked about the woman it actually belonged to, the one none of them had ever mentioned, the one I'd found buried under 100 years of silence and smoke. Fair was never the point. Vera spread the register across the table like it was a map. The room was dim but warm, lit by a small desk lamp and the soft glow from the hall. Outside, Savannah's winter rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, there was only paper and S. Silence. She slid her finger down one column. The pendant was listed as a wedding gift. That alone increases its provenance. But what's more interesting, she paused, turning the page, is who originally commissioned the piece. A man named Lawrence Hartwell, railroad heir, quiet name in the 1890s, very few surviving records. And it was never insured. Not after the fire, it vanished from the register. No claim, no follow-up. As far as every document after 1912 is concerned, it never existed. I exhaled slowly, so what would it fetch? Vera leaned back in her chair and studied me. At a private sale, north of 7 figures, maybe higher. If I published this report and connected it to a verified historical auction house, it would make the catalog cover. I nodded once, and if I never sell it. She smiled, not kindly, but with a kind of approval I hadn't seen from her before. Then it becomes legacy, not liquid, which is harder to steal. That night, I opened a new document on my laptop titled, Living Trust, Holden Legacy Fund. I listed myself as custodian. I named no beneficiaries. I wrote a disinheritance clause so explicit even the most opportunistic family member couldn't crack it. No vague language, no loopholes. The pendant wasn't just protected, it was removed from visibility, from speculation, from the games Elaine and Trent thought they knew how to play. I called Lena the next morning. Can you review a trust draft? She pulled it up while we were still on the phone. You've been busy. Just cautious. No, this is clean, ironclad. By that afternoon, it was signed, filed, and vaulted digitally under the same alias we'd used for the valuation. Separate from the estate, unreachable by probate. The next week, Elaine and Trent filed a public records request for any amended holdings or concealed assets of sentimental or ambiguous value. Lena forwarded me the request with a subject line that simply read, "They're grasping." They found nothing. Not a file, not a trace of a trust, not even a hint that something had moved behind the curtains. Because everything that mattered now lived in shadow, locked down in legal glass they'd never have the tools to shatter. Lena called me later that day. Do you want me to respond officially? No, I said, let the silence work. She paused, then said, you're getting good at this. I didn't answer. Because the truth was, it wasn't about strategy anymore, it was about preservation. Theirs had always been about power, mine was about remembering. That night, I sat at the desk and wrote a letter to myself, not a legal note, not a record for court, just a line I needed to see in my own handwriting. Let them try harder, every move reveals them more. I folded it and placed it in the same drawer where my mother had once kept her estate planner and a photo of me in kindergarten. I added nothing else. I didn't check social media that week. I didn't respond to Trent's follow-up text. I didn't ask Lena for updates on the next filing window. Because I knew what they were doing. And more importantly, I finally understood why my mother had never talked about Margaret or the fire or what was lost. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting me. And maybe she knew this moment would come. It arrived by courier, hand-delivered in a cream envelope that looked too formal for what it contained. Lena opened it without ceremony, spreading the photocopy across her desk while I stood behind her. The document was styled to look like an amendment, supposedly handwritten, dated 6 months before my mother died. It was short, clumsy, and obvious. My mother's signature was there at the bottom, but the rest, the ink color was off. The language sounded foreign in her voice. She never would have used phrases like redistribute for fairness or equalize perceived imbalances. Elaine and Trent's names were written in full twice, as if to underline the point. Lena didn't say anything right away. She just turned the page, ran her hand over the surface, then looked up at me. Amateurs, she muttered. I took a seat. Will it hold? She shook her head. Not even close. They must have used a sample signature from an old holiday card or something equally public, but there are inconsistencies all over it. Pen pressure, slant, loop formation. It's not her. How fast can we prove it? I already called someone, she said. They'll have an expert report by Friday, independent and court certified. She was calm, but her calm was different now, not defensive, not strategic. It was surgical. By the time we walked into the courthouse the following Tuesday, Lena had 2 reports, a sealed affidavit, and a signed statement from Vera confirming the pendant's known history and current location. She carried it all in a thin leather binder, as if the weight of the truth didn't require volume, only precision. The courtroom was half full. Family court always felt strangely casual, like a meeting that forgot to end, but Elaine was dressed like it was a funeral. Trent wore a blazer too tight across his shoulders, shifting in his seat every 30 seconds. I didn't look at either of them. I didn't have to. When the judge asked for opening remarks, Lena stood and handed the expert report directly to the bench. No performance, no speech, just a line. We believe the court will find this document materially illuminating. The judge skimmed the pages, his brow furrowed at the signature analysis. Elaine leaned in to whisper something to Trent. He didn't answer. The judge looked up. Counselor, is there a recommendation from your office regarding this supposed amendment? Lena nodded. Our recommendation is that it be dismissed as invalid and excluded from the record. The forensic evidence is conclusive. The signature is not authentic. Elaine stiffened. Trent's legs started bouncing. The judge continued reading. The silence stretched. Then he laid the report down flat and looked at Elaine directly. Is there anything you'd like to say before I issue my ruling? Elaine opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Trent stood too fast. This is ridiculous. That's her handwriting, she told us. The judge held up a hand. Sir, you will sit down or be removed. Trent didn't move. She meant for us to have something, he said, louder now. She talked about being fair. We were there. You think she just left us nothing? Elaine was crying now, shoulders tight, face turned away from the gallery. The tears weren't grief, they were cornered. I sat perfectly still. The judge exhaled through his nose, looked at Lena, then back at the forged amendment. This is either desperation or deception. Either way, it does not rise to the level of legal weight. The document is excluded. All parties are advised that further misrepresentations will be subject to sanction. He banged his gavel once. I didn't move until Lena gently tapped my arm. Let's go. As we walked past the row where Elaine and Trent sat, neither of them looked up. The heat had drained out of them, and something colder had taken its place. In the hallway, I reached into my coat pocket and found the envelope Lena had given me days ago, the one she'd said was just in case. I hadn't opened it. Now I did. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, clean, precise. A draft motion for disinheritance protections. I looked at Lena. You knew this was coming, I said. She nodded once. And I realized I had too. The cemetery was empty when I arrived, not just quiet, but still in that way winter mornings can be, like the cold had pressed pause on the world. I parked beneath the same tree I remembered from the service. Spanish moss hung low, trembling in the breeze. My mother's grave was 3 rows in, tucked between 2 names I didn't recognize. A simple stone, her maiden name etched beneath her married one, the birth and death years too neat, too even. I sat on the bench nearby and unzipped my bag. Inside, the original will still folded, edges soft from handling. I hadn't looked at it since the day it was read aloud. But now, with the forged amendment behind us and the air beginning to settle around everything they'd tried to take, I needed to see her signature again. Clean straight, not like the one they faked. I pressed my thumb to the ink, knowing it meant nothing legally but everything to me. The last real conversation I'd had with her played in my head, uninvited. It had been the night after a family argument, something petty, something about furniture, I think. Elaine had accused her of being too emotional. Trent had stormed out saying she was impossible. My mother had sat beside me on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tired but not defeated. "They think if it doesn't glitter, it doesn't matter," she said. She stood, crossed the room, and opened the hall closet. From the highest shelf she pulled down the wooden box, the one that would someday change everything. "This is yours," she said, "not because it's valuable, because it will be." I didn't understand at the time. She paused at the door before she left the room and added, almost to herself, "Some things aren't pretty until someone else wants them." Now, years later, the meaning had landed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded paper I'd written earlier that morning. Just one sentence, scribbled in pencil on thick stationery. "They're doing exactly what you said they would." I slipped it beneath a stone and tucked it at the base of the headstone where no one else would see it. Not a tribute, not a goodbye, just a note between the two of us, the kind we used to pass back and forth after family gatherings when the room got too sharp to stay in. Before I left, I touched the corner of the grave marker, not the name, not the dates, just the edge, like pressing a seal closed. Back home, I made tea without turning on the radio. An hour later, my phone buzzed, a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Claire, it was Vera." "Yes." "I thought you'd want this." Her voice was softer than usual. "I found it while reorganizing old client photos for the archives." A few seconds later, an image popped into my messages, black and white, grainy but clear enough. My mother, 17, maybe 18, hair tied back in a ribbon, no makeup, and around her neck, unmistakable even in grayscale, the pendant. She wasn't smiling, but there was a kind of calm in her eyes I'd never noticed in person, like she knew what was coming long before I did. I stared at the photo for a long time, then saved it to a hidden album on my phone, not because I needed to hide it, but because some things weren't meant to be seen by everyone. Some things were meant to last, quietly, carefully, in the spaces no one thinks to look. The newspaper was already folded when I saw it left on the counter of the bookstore next to the register, beside the unpaid receipt for someone's morning coffee. Page 4, local interest, tucked under an article about a bakery reopening after a kitchen fire. Probate dispute over historic estate draws quiet attention in Savannah. No names, no direct quotes, but the phrase "allegations of falsified amendments and estate manipulation among long-standing family lines" did enough heavy lifting. In this town, a single vague sentence is sharper than a headline, and everyone always knows who. I left the paper on the counter, didn't fold it, didn't hide it, let it lie there like a rumor with teeth. By noon I could feel the shift. Customers looked a little too long before speaking, 2 regulars paid in silence. The UPS driver didn't make his usual joke. I pretended not to notice. It wasn't until late afternoon that someone finally broke the pattern. A woman, maybe in her late 60s, placed a small paperback on the counter, looked me straight in the eye and said quietly, "Your mother was good to my sister after the flood in '91. I haven't forgotten that." She didn't say anything else, just paid in cash and walked out. I stood at the register for a long time after she left, letting the weight of that sentence settle into me like a held breath I didn't realize I'd been keeping. The article spread faster than I expected. Not online, not in comments or group threads, but in churches, salons, garden clubs, Vera called the next morning her Voic. Sharp with disbelief. My phone's been ringing nonstop, she said. Someone asked if I'm the woman from the pendant scandal. I didn't even know we had one. She was half laughing, but I could tell she was bracing for more. I asked her if she wanted me to distance myself. No, she said flatly. If anything, they're finally taking me seriously. But the other side of the story, the one that hadn't been printed, played out in whispers too. Elaine had been spotted crying in the back pew at St. Mary's the previous Sunday, not the loud kind, the quiet, cornered kind. A woman from her bridge group told Lena she hadn't answered a call in over a week. Trent, meanwhile, had deleted his social media without a word. His last post, a blurry meme about delusional heirs, had already been screenshotted and quietly passed around. Lena printed it just in case. They've mocked the truth for so long they think it's beneath them, she said. When I asked her to draft a cease and desist, she didn't hesitate. Just Elaine and Trent, she asked. All of them, I said, anyone who's forwarded, implied, or interfered. She blinked, then gave a slow, satisfied nod. On it. We mailed them out certified, no fanfare, just the legal equivalent of a locked door with no key. A week later, the court clerk scheduled the final probate hearing. The notice was polite but direct. The judge would issue his final ruling, and any further unfounded claims could carry financial consequences. Lena underlined that line in red and slid the paper across her desk. They didn't think there'd be a cost, she said. There always is. Elaine never responded to the legal notice, not formally, not through counsel. Trent sent a one-word email, seriously. We didn't answer. Because by then, it wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. They'd pushed the story for months, the lies, the sarcasm, the theatrics. Now the air had shifted, and the silence was louder than anything they could post or claim or fabricate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt intact. That night, I opened the folder my mother had left in the closet, the one I hadn't touched since sealing the trust. Tucked inside a yellowed envelope was a clipping I hadn't noticed before. Family vault lost to fire, jewelry gone forever. Dated January 1912. She'd kept it all these years without a word. Because some things weren't saved for explanation. They were saved for proof. And the day had finally come. The museum wasn't much from the outside. A former manor on a quiet street just beyond the heart of Savannah, peeling shutters, ivy creeping into the brickwork, a plaque half faded by weather. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it, which made it perfect. Inside, it smelled like wood polish and time. Marable Wynne, the director, met me in a back office that felt more like a historian's attic than a workspace. The desk was cluttered with old ledgers and teacups, a cracked globe resting under a dusty lampshade. She didn't offer small talk. She just opened a black box lined in velvet. The pendant sat in the center, lit by the slanting sun through her window. Even muted by shadow, it held its depth, its silence, like it had always belonged in a room where no one raised their voice. I won't donate it, I said before she could ask. Marable didn't flinch. We don't require donation, a loan is enough. I nodded. No names, I added, nothing on a plaque, not mine. Marable paused. Your mother S. I hesitated, not because I didn't want it, but because I hadn't thought of it that way. Yes, I said finally, use her maiden name, quietly. Of course. Lena drafted the loan agreement the next morning. It was structured through the Holden Legacy Trust with a clause directing all net proceeds from ticket surcharges, donations, and partner events into a scholarship fund, renewable annually, girls from Chatham County, fields of study, law, history, arts, a preference for students raised by single mothers. No one needed to know why, but I did. When I told Vera, she didn't speak. She just showed up at my door 2 days later with a folder and a thumb drive. The exhibit write-up, she said, and the source notes. She handed me a draft, title, The Pendant That Survived the Fire, A Quiet Legacy Restored. Beneath it, no author credit, no mention of me. Just a footnote, recovered by a surviving relative. It spoke of Margaret, of the fire, of the inheritance that was never claimed because no one had asked the right questions or wanted to. The museum opened the exhibit quietly, no ribbon cutting, no press release, no gala, just a small display in the corner parlor of the old home lit by warm gallery lighting, the pendant floating inside a sealed glass case, framed by nothing but silence and reverence. I didn't tell anyone I was going, I didn't even tell Lena. I stood in the back of the room behind a column pretending to read a pamphlet while I watched visitors drift through, most pass. Ed quickly. But two little girls, maybe 9, maybe 10, stopped in front of the case. One pointed at the pendant, the other leaned in, brow furrowed in fascination. Neither of them spoke. But I could see it on their faces, the moment when something ancient and elegant clicks into a young mind like a secret being handed down not through words but through awe. They didn't know what it was. But they understood it mattered. That was enough. After closing, I returned briefly. Marable had offered me the option to keep the pendant on permanent loan. But I shook my head, just the term we agreed to. The pendant came home in the same box, now stored in a private drawer beneath lock and insurance. I didn't open it again, not even to look. Some things don't need to be displayed to be real. That night, I poured tea, turned off the lights, and opened my mother's old journal for the last time. Most of the entries were scattered thoughts, clippings, notes she'd written to herself and never read aloud, but one line had been underlined in pencil. Let the past remember itself. I sat with that for a long time. And then, for the first time in years, I lit a candle on what would have been her birthday. No cake, no toast, just the flame, a still room, and the quiet sense that nothing had been wasted, not her words, not her silence, not the pendant. Not me. The final hearing wasn't public. No reporters, no gallery, just a judge, Lena, and a stack of documents that felt more like an obituary than legal filings. We met in a private side room at the courthouse, the kind with worn paneling, a flickering fluorescent light, and a window that faced a brick wall. Still, it felt sacred in its own way, sacred and necessary. The judge looked over the papers in silence, pen tapping once, twice, then he spoke without looking up. You're aware that most families never request this. I'm aware, I said. No right of contact, no future claims, no standing of relation. You understand what that means long-term. I do. He looked at Lena. She's not doing this to hurt them, Lena said. She's doing this to finish something they wouldn't let rest. That settled the air. He signed without ceremony. Effective immediately, he said. No member of the named parties, Elaine Holden or Trent Holden, may initiate legal claim, inquiry, or contact regarding the estate of Margaret Holden or any of its legal successors. All rights dissolved. The pen clicked shut like the lid on a casket. We walked out quietly, no words until we were down the courthouse steps. Lena handed me a fresh envelope. Next phase. I nodded, yes. Inside were the final documents establishing the Holden Archive Trust, the legal shell now holding everything that mattered: the jewelry, the letters, the family photo albums, my mother's journal, the appraisal reports, and the velvet box that started all of it. Not to be sold, not to be contested, not to be touched by anyone who had mocked, minimized, or betrayed its contents. A living vault, legally protected, emotionally untouchable. I wrote the final clause myself. Those who mocked the value of memory will not hold its weight. 2 days later, I met Vera one last time at her office. She already knew why I was there. No pleasantries, no coffee. She placed the original gemological report in a fire-safe envelope, along with the high-resolution scans and full appraisal ledger. Then she handed me a roll of red tamper tape and said nothing. I want it sealed, I said. She nodded, even from future archivists. Even from me. She didn't try to talk me out of it, just helped me secure the envelope, then filed it into a locked drawer inside her private archive under the pseudonym we'd chosen months earlier. No name, no label, just a coded entry only she and I would ever understand. And then she reached under her desk and pulled out a small black box. For you, she said. Inside, a jeweler's loop, old-fashioned, polished steel. Engraved on one side were 5 small words. Not all value is visible. I didn't say thank you, I didn't have to. 3 days later, a white envelope arrived in my mailbox. My name in slanted cursive on the front. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Elaine. I didn't tear it, didn't burn it. I placed it inside the return-to-sender sleeve Lena had prepared in advance, sealed it, and walked it to the mailbox at the end of the street. I slid it in without hesitation. Unopened, unread, unworthy. That night I updated my own will. 4 pages, no beneficiaries from the family, no executors tied to bloodlines that forgot what blood is supposed to mean, just one line that mattered. Let silence speak where names failed. I signed it and filed it under my mother's original estate documents. Then I added one final postscript in my own handwriting. They don't get to write the ending, I do. Because this wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even legacy. It was a door. And I had closed it. Not with age. Not with guilt. Not with noise. Just with resolve. Clean. Quiet. Final. The scholarship announcement wasn't public. No banquet, no oversized check, no smiling photo for the paper, just a quiet email from the foundation coordinator confirming the first award had been accepted. The recipient was a 17-year-old girl from just outside Savannah, top of her class, a love for archival research, and a handwritten note at the bottom of her application that read, "I want to study the kind of history that gets left out." I opened the attached letter slowly, the way you open something fragile. Her words were careful, earnest, grateful in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. Thank you for giving someone like me a chance. I promise to honor the story behind this gift, even if I never know it. I didn't cry, not the dramatic kind anyway, but the back of my throat tightened and I had to set the paper down because my hands weren't steady. It wasn't pride, exactly. It wasn't even relief. It was something quieter, a loosening. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like something had moved forward instead of closing in. Later that week, a small package arrived at the bookstore, no return address. The handwriting on the label was unmistakably Vera S., sharp, looping, intentional. Inside was a velvet-lined jeweler's box. Nestled inside, a loop polished to a soft sheen, the brass warm against my fingers. I lifted it to the light and that's when I saw the engraving on the barrel. Not all value is visible. I sat with it for a long moment, thumb on the cool metal. It wasn't a goodbye gift, not really. It was more of a benediction, Vera's way of saying she trusted me to guard what mattered now that she had stepped back. She retired officially the next day. No farewell party, no final appointment calendar, just a locked door, a darkened window, and a handwritten sign taped inside the glass. Closed permanently. It felt right, some chapters don't end loudly. A few weeks later, the museum's loan term expired. Marable called to ask whether I wanted to extend the exhibit. Her tone was gentle, not persuasive. "If you'd like it to stay a bit longer, we can accommodate," she said. "No," I told her, "it's time to bring it home." When I arrived, she led me into the back office where the pendant sat in its traveling case. She opened the lid carefully, not theatrically, just respectfully. The sapphire caught the lamplight in a slow, deliberate way, as if it had learned not to reveal itself too quickly. I didn't touch it, just nodded. Back home, I placed the case inside the vault on the highest shelf beside the sealed gem report and the original family documents I had gathered into one quiet archive. The pendant didn't belong on a mantelpiece or a necklace chain or a museum shelf for eager hands to point at. It had done its work. It had told its story. Now it could rest. That night, I pulled out my mother's journal for the last time. Not to reread it, I knew every line by heart now. Instead, I flipped to the final entry, the one with the faded red underline. "Let the past remember itself." For months, that sentence had felt like a riddle. Tonight, it felt like release. She hadn't asked me to carry the past. She'd asked me to acknowledge it, protect it, let it stand on its own legs instead of on her shoulders or mine. I closed the journal gently and placed it inside the drawer where it belonged. On her birthday, I didn't bake a cake or set a place at the table. I didn't call anyone or post anything. The house was quiet the way she liked quiet, soft, purposeful, without apology. I lit a single candle on the windowsill, beeswax, slow burning, the kind she favored. The flame steadied after a moment, bright enough to cast a thin glow across the room. I sat beside it and watched the light flicker against the glass. No sadness. No sharp edges. Just warmth and breath and space. She had spent her whole life protecting things people didn't understand. Now finally I was doing the same. And it felt like peace. Not the kind you chase. The kind you earn. The transfer papers were signed at a long, polished table in a private legal office overlooking the Savannah River. No press, no plaque, just two witnesses, a notary, and a thin folder that carried more weight than any safe deposit box ever could. The pendant was donated under an anonymous deed, not to the museum directly but to a long-term trust-backed cultural archive with strict limitations: no resale, no press releases, no acknowledgments. It would live in rotation, displayed only on certain anniversaries, with its origin labeled simply as recovered family piece, early 1900s, cashmere sapphire, provenance protected. Its legacy was intact, but it was untouchable. Elaine and Trent never saw it again. They heard things, of course, whispers, a gallery opening with murmured references to the fire pendant, a comment in passing at a benefit dinner about that appraisal. Case, the one with the inheritance twist. But nothing concrete, no details they could verify, no name they could trace. They'd spent years trying to own it, now they couldn't even find it. I moved out of the city that spring. Just a little house, quiet, white shutters, a screened porch, and a view of the river through tall grass and old oak. The mailbox still read Holden, but only because I hadn't bothered to change it. Inside, the rooms were sparse, clean lines, books stacked instead of shelved, a kettle always just 1 minute from boiling. On the living room bookshelf, I kept one framed photo, not of my mother, not of Margaret, not of anyone, just the pendant. The museum's photographer had captured it beautifully, sapphire centered in soft gold against black velvet, but it was the label beneath the image that made me keep it visible. Protected by silence. I didn't speak about it anymore. Didn't explain, didn't correct. And most people didn't ask, not directly. They had learned in their own way that there are some stories that carry more when left unfinished. At a local book fair in June, a girl at one of the poetry tables looked at me with wide eyes. She couldn't have been older than 16. "You're the woman from that story, right?" she asked, voice quiet but clear. I didn't ask what story. I just smiled and said, "Not every story ends where you think it does." She grinned, nodded like she understood, and turned back to her notebook. That night, after the windows were closed and the porch light dimmed, I pulled out my journal, not the one I'd kept for court filings and legal notes, but the one my mother had given me on my 30th birthday. The leather was cracked now, the pages soft and curling at the corners. I turned to the last page and wrote a single line. Some jewelry shines, some exposes. Then I closed the book for the final time. I didn't need to revisit it anymore, not because I was finished healing. Healing doesn't always announce itself with an endpoint, but because the work was done, the silence had served its purpose. They never understood that. They thought power came from noise, from arguments, from accusations, from courtroom theatrics and desperate amendments scribbled in shaky hands. They thought inheritance was about what you could hold, steal, divide. But they were wrong. Because the real weight, the real value, had never been in the pendant itself. It was in the proof. The gemologist's report, the lineage traced, the seal on the vault, the scholarship accepted by a girl who would carry forward a story she didn't even know she belonged to. It was in the archive now, in the silence, in the things they couldn't touch. They mocked my worthless jewelry. Then the gemologist's report came back. And I never had to explain a single thing.